When people talk about Doom Eternal's combat philosophy, intense aggression, tactical awareness, careful ammo use, and constant enemy presence, it feels like something entirely new. But if you look back at the evolution of first-person shooters, you find echoes of that philosophy in places many players don't immediately associate with Doom. One of the biggest early examples is Far Cry 2004, the first game in the franchise developed by Crytek and published by Ubisoft. While Far Cry is stylistically far from Doom's hellish chaos, it actually set groundwork for aspects of tactical FPS design that Eternal would take much further. Far Cry was a watershed moment for shooters because it didn't just drop players into linear corridors. It presented open space, dynamic foes, and emergent threats at a time when many FPS games focused merely on scripted enemy waves. In Far Cry, combat encounters weren't simply stand here and shoot moments. They were environmental problems players had to approach purposefully. You could sneak in tall grass, flank enemy camps, create distraction with gadgets, choose your weapons based on range and scenario, tag opponents before engagement, and generally make decisions that would strongly affect outcomes. Far Cry's enemies reacted dynamically, coordinating, calling for reinforcements, using cover, and altering patrols based on your actions. This was a leap beyond the scripted, repetitive AI behavior common at the time. This design philosophy, giving players friction over agency and forcing them to reassess situations and tools, resembles Eternal's insistence that you use all your tools and situational options in the most efficient way to survive. In Far Cry, just like in Doom Eternal's case, ammo was scarce, and enemy behavior and positioning mattered far more than in many games of its era. Enemies would flank you or suppress you from cover. Some would retreat or adapt to your decisions. You could tag foes before combat, giving you a tactical edge. Terrain, foliage, and sound were part of the engagement decisions. These elements made combat less about pure reaction and more about planning, observation, and prioritization, much like Eternal's rhythm of attacking, repositioning, and resource management within arenas. Far Cry wasn't a gore fest, it was a thinking shooter long before tactical gameplay became a buzzword. In that sense, it asked players to engage with enemy ecosystems and choose how and when to expend resources in the most efficient way, a concept that Eternal took into ultra-aggressive territory. Far Cry's design forced low ammo in a similar way Doom Eternal does, but it made you think about your loadout and engagement pace much more frequently than you do in Doom Eternal, given the absence of an ammo farming tool. Far Cry limited you to a sensible number of weapons, forcing players to make choices rather than hoarding a dozen tools. This is a very early example of the kind of weapon selection and resource evaluation that modern tactical FPS games built upon. Eternal's combat loops, switching weapons to manage ammo, prioritizing tactical equipment, freeze, flame, chainsaw, and making split-second decisions about resource usage, can be seen as an evolution of the same philosophy. Far Cry introduced, don't just shoot reflexively, assess, adapt, and commit. One of Far Cry's major innovations was enemy AI that felt alive, soldiers responding to your presence, calling for backup, cooperating, retreating, and flanking. While Eternal's demons are, of course, supernatural rather than mercenary, the underlying principle is similar. Combat isn't static, it's fluid. Players must read enemy behavior, exploit weaknesses, control space, and adjust tactics on the fly. Doom Eternal's faster pace and more chaotic direct combat are a very different context, but the idea that combat should reward smart engagement over blind aggression was present in early tactical FPS design long before Eternal. That's why looking at a game like Far Cry as a distant ancestor of Doom Eternal's philosophy, not in aesthetics but in principles, makes sense. Far Cry's approach to combat wasn't about scripted waves, it was about open scenarios where players could choose engagement methods. Whether you chose stealth, full-on assault, distraction, or retreat, the encounter could shift. This is the same player-centric problem-solving Eternal demands, albeit at a much more frantic pace. Eternal doesn't tell you how to fight every demon, it gives you tools and forces you to improvise within the system. And both games encouraged, although not loudly, an intended best route of playing through efficiency and instruction following. Both games manage the player instead of offering them true player agency. It might sound odd to compare a jungle tactical shooter from 2004 with a hellish demon slaughter game from 2020, but the design DNA has parallels. Player agency in combat, Far Cry empowered player management, Eternal demands it. Enemy responsiveness, early dynamic AI in Far Cry echoes Eternal's reactive demons. Tactical resource consideration. Far Cry made you care about loadouts, Eternal forces weapon resource cycling. Non-linear engagement, both games reward spatial awareness and adaptability through instruction following. Seen this way, the original Far Cry was a stepping stone in FPS design, one that helped shift expectations from run-and-gun reflex shooters toward engagement-driven encounters that rely on player decision and adaptation. Doom Eternal didn't invent that philosophy, but it perfected a version of it within its own high-octane, aggressive framework. That's why it's fair to say there was a kind of proto-Doom Eternal long before the name existed. And that game, quietly laying groundwork for tactical thought in shooters, was the first Far Cry. Once you strip away the visuals, the speed, and the marketing buzzwords, you start seeing the same design philosophy repeating itself, just dressed up differently for different eras. Far Cry hid its management behind realism and atmosphere. Doom Eternal put that same management front and center and dared you to master it. Doom Eternal isn't the first shooter to apply this philosophy. It didn't invent management-driven combat, it didn't invent pressure-based efficiency, it didn't invent conditioning the player toward optimal behavior. Far Cry did it first. It just did it quietly, through AI behavior, environment, escalation, and consequence, instead of meters, cooldowns, and explicit loops. Doom Eternal didn't create a new idea. It refined, formalized, and made visible an approach that was already there. And once you see that lineage, a lot of modern FPS design suddenly makes more sense. If you enjoyed this kind of breakdown, the design philosophy side of shooters, the why this feels the way it does conversations, you'll find more of it on Myth Night Expanded. Until next time, take it easy, stay sharp, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers, legends.